All right, ladies and gentlemen. So I wanted to kind of just do a backup. You know, I know that this probably won't be terribly insightful for all of you, but I wanted to just do it anyway. You know, I think that in talking with many Christians over the years, that there seems to be just missing maybe the big picture of this thing. And I think doing the who, what, when, where, why, and how on the beginning of this book would be a good foundation place to start. So when was this book written? Yeah, probably about 3,400 years ago, somewhere around there is probably the best estimates that we have. And who wrote this book?
Was it Moses?
It was Moshe. It was Moses, yes. Now, why was this book written? Is this the earliest book in the Bible?
Probably, unless they had
Job.
It is not. The book of Job, by all accounts, is probably the oldest book in the Bible. In fact, you can see in the book of Jasher relates a lot of the same information that is in the book of Genesis, and Joshua references the book of Jasher. So you know that if Joshua is referencing the book of Jasher, then it either was written before Moses wrote his books, or they were being written contemporaneously. And so, for what purpose was this book written? It's according to, as far as your understanding is. Is this a history book?
I'd say part of it,
An
yes.
instruction book.
It's an instruction manual, absolutely.
And history and everything else.
And it's a pointer towards the Messiah.
It's all, yeah, the Messiah, Yeshua, says it's all written about him, which I think if you get below the surface of just the stories, then you can see that really clearly. And I know that, you know, those of us who have been in the Torah cycle for a number of years now have had a lot of those things revealed to us by good scholars who are, you know, digging below the surface and showing you that the Messiah, Yeshua, is hidden in plain sight everywhere in the Torah. And I think what we might, you know, what we need to consider, frankly, is that this book, and frankly, I think we also need to remember that the 5 books of Moshe, the Torah, is actually one book. There's no divisions for chapters. There's no divisions for books. That was all done artificially, breaking it up into Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It was one book, and then it was broken up. Okay, and I think that we need to recall that this is really about the beginning of God's people, the beginning of God's family. Because remember, who was the beginning of God's family? Who did it start with?
Adam and Eve.
The Word.
Well,
Messiah.
I mean, as far as humanity is concerned, where does this?
Adam.
Well, Adam. That in a sense, yes, because he's the first man created, and you can trace the lineage from Adam to who's the big figure? Abraham. That's right. So it's, you know, Father Abraham. He's the guy who was found faithful, and who, you know, he says, "I'm going to make your descendants to be a blessing in the earth, and nations will bless themselves by your name." Okay? So then we have his children, and we break out into the 12 tribes, and then we break out into slavery in Egypt. We're there for how long?
300 years.
Probably 400 years. Okay? Now that just to keep that in perspective, that is quite a bit longer than the United States has been a country.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, think of how the United States has changed in just 200 and some odd years.
Yeah, right down the tubes.
Well, in a sense, yeah. But I mean, we started off with, you know, a few thousand people in these spread out across the eastern seaboard, you know, and now we've got, what, 230 million people here? You can see how, you know, obviously with some medical advancements and such, we've been able to populate this place like crazy. But consider how much our society has changed in just the 200 and some odd years that we've been here. And I think we could all agree that the country here was founded upon some godly principles by some godly men who, a lot of them, Puritans wanting to free themselves from popishness, and started off on a good foot, but it has degenerated. So in estimating that, you see that the 70 sons of Abraham, Jacob, went into Egypt and became a great nation there. By some estimates, up to 1.5 million to 2 million people who left Egypt, and that doesn't even include the mixed multitude, I don't think. So now we've got Moses backing up, because you know how we can forget our history. I know that we forget our history here.
Yeah.
Do you think it's true for these Israelites who have been living in Egyptian slavery for 400 years?
Yeah.
Not that they were in slavery for the full 400 years. I'm sure that things went okay with them for a while. But even if it was half that time, that's as old as the United States, you can forget a lot of stuff. And I think that it bears it's good to bear in mind that why this book was written, part of it, at least a good, from just a basic level, is that we've got a whole nation of slaves that have just come out of Egypt, and that's when this book was written, to inform these people, who are you? What are you doing here? How did you get here? Where are you going? And what are the rules? It's all included in this book called the Torah, this one book called the Torah. And we're just going to deal with the first section of this book in Genesis, because and only, probably up to about chapter 27, I think, because not too long ago we did a study on the life of Joseph. So we went from chapter 27 to chapter 50 or 52 and finished up the last half of the book and saw a lot of really amazing pictures, parallels between Yeshua and Joseph. So that was pretty cool. So today, though, we want to just start here with the basics. And what do you think? What would you say is one of the highlight? What are some of the highlights of the book of Genesis? Like key important stuff that is, good information to have. That it's also, good information for your soul instead of just historical facts. What would you say are some of the key highlights?
Well, how things got started is for one.
Yeah,
And
knowing
who started it, who
knowing the
made it.
beginning is pretty important. Absolutely.
God has a plan.
That you can see that God is at work and is working everything out according to His plan right from the very beginning. That's a powerful thing to know. You got some foundational key players like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their children. Gives you a lot of very interesting information. What's that?
Messianic prophecy.
A ton of messianic prophecies. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think we also see shadows or pieces that you can string together to show that these people knew the Torah before it was given to Moses.
That's a good insight, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. That you can see pretty clearly that even before the instructions were given by God to Moses to the people, that the people before that were already observing these instructions. And I have said this a few times. It's probably been a few years, but frankly, I think, if I have my own little society here in my house, and it's me and my wife and my 2 children, I can disseminate the instructions fairly easily and fairly quickly, and I only need to teach, my wife and I are on the same page, and we just need to teach these 2 children. But, if suddenly we wanted to take the principles of this household and expand it to a whole society, well, things get complicated rather quickly, and we might need to start writing down some rules. So I think that's probably a good picture to have in your head, is that the people of God have known the instructions of God for a long, long time and have followed them, and they have been passed down orally. But that when you get a gigantic group of people that you need to start organizing a society, you need to publish the data. You need to promulgate those rules in a way that everybody can see and understand, and get everybody signing up and saying, yeah, we agree, that's the way we're going to do it. So I think that's why, that's a good reason for the book being written. So with that kind of foundation laid, It is time
Alan,
to start. Yes, ma'am.
just one other thing that I feel about learning from it is that we can learn about the end
Oh, yes.
because it's
That's an-
cyclical.
That's
We
an
can
excellent insight. You are absolutely
learn what's
correct.
coming.
That, you know, he says, I declare the end from the beginning, and you can definitely see in certain prophetic passages from these sections, you can see echoes and reflections of the book of Revelation in the book of the Genesis and in Bereshit. It's all there.
It's a mirror.
It is a mirror. That's a good way to look at it. Today we're using the concordant literal version. I did find some issues with the concordant literal version, and I don't know what translation you're using, but I wanted us to try to get as close to a literal translation of the Hebrew as we can, because there are some critical issues with understanding what it actually says in Hebrew instead of just relying upon it. We all know that Hebrew defies English translation. It really does. And so we have to look carefully. But let us start here with this first section, chapter 1, verses 1 to 13, and then we'll discuss some ideas.
Ellen, you're not able to make it large, probably, right? Because it's most likely a slide.
It is.
No.
Yes. Yes. So if you're reading along, you can check the concordant literal version. The Darby translation or the Young's literal translation would probably be closest. So, created by Elohim were the heavens and the earth. The earth became an empty wasteland and darkness on the face of the submerged chaos. Yet the spirit of Elohim is vibrating over the surface of the water, and saying is Elohim, become light, and it is becoming light. And seeing is Elohim the light, that it is good. And separating is Elohim between the light and the darkness, and calling Elohim the light day, and the darkness he calls night. And coming is it to be evening, and coming to be morning, day one. And saying is Elohim, become shall an atmosphere in the midst of the water, and coming is a separation between water and water. And coming is it to be so. And making is Elohim the atmosphere, and separating is he between the water which is under the atmosphere and the water which is above the atmosphere. And calling Elohim, he is calling the atmosphere heavens, and coming is it to be evening, and coming to be morning, the second day. And saying is Elohim, flow together shall the water from under the heavens to one place, and appear shall the dry land, meaning he separated again. And coming is it to be so, and flowing together is the water under the heavens to one place, and appearing is the dry land. And calling is Elohim the dry part, earth, and the confluence of the water he calls seas. And seeing is Elohim that it is good. And saying is Elohim, verdant shall become the land with verdure, greenery, shrubbery, sorry, with herbage, growing seed for its from kind and for its likeness, with the fruit tree whose seed is on the land. And coming is it to be so. And forth is the land bringing verdure, herbage, sowing seed from its from kind, and the fruit tree producing fruit with seed for its from kind. And seeing is Elohim that it is good. And coming is it to be evening, and coming to be morning, the third day. I'm terribly sorry. This is a challenging read, I know. But it is a challenging read, but I wanted you to get a better sense of what the Hebrew literally says, because it's going to become really critical for a couple of issues here to take a look at. So starting with Bereshit, in the beginning, created Elohim the heavens and the earth. Now, what's with the word Elohim? What does that mean?
Gods.
It means gods. Is this saying that in the beginning gods created the heavens and the earth?
Yep.
In a sense, it does seem to be saying that. So how are we to translate that? We're not polytheistic. And you know that this word, that's the word for God, and it is used thousands of times But why is it plural?
Can it be Trinitarian?
Many think so, yes. That this is a plural form of God, showing the plurality. Some call it plenary power, showing that this God is the God of gods. That's why they refer to him in a plural sense.
The interesting thing is that the word created is singular.
Yes.
So it says Elohim, plural, created, one created. So I could imagine, I mean, there's a lot of indications that Yeshua was already there in the beginning, was with Elohim. And it even says in Proverbs 8, I believe, it talks about wisdom, and I was there with him when he created and so forth.
Yeah.
So I believe that the Messiah Yeshua was there, but only one of them created, and that's the question. Did the Messiah create?
According to the book of John.
Did the Father create?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. According to the book of John, he created nothing. It was one of the other epistles too said that there's nothing that had not been created that wasn't created by Yeshua. He was there.
By or through? Is there a difference?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know what you would say in the Greek, but I know that for example, last time we talked, Angela was talking about how in the beginning was the word, this word et, which is not translatable into English. It's not there at all, but we know that that's the Aleph and the Tav, the Alpha and the Omega. It's part of it. It's built right in, and that is God. Yes, Tracy.
Well, it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around this, our flesh heads, but the thing is, he is the Word of God, and it is through the Word of God that all things are created.
Right.
Right? So it's, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but it's like they have to come out of his mouth, and Messiah was that Word made flesh. So, I don't know, I'm making the connection that it is the Father that created through his Word, which is his Son.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to look at it. I think that's a very good way to look at it, and I think that you can definitely see, just by the use of the word Elohim, that God has multiple parts, and that it's, you might call it Trinitarian. You might say, well, it's the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and that's certainly true. At least the parts that we know of. He is a powerful, powerful being. And I think as far as the rabbinic interpretation of this passage, they talk about the plenary power, that God is referred to in a plural form just because he's immense, and you can't, it would just be weird to refer to him, in a singular sense would just seem odd. I think that either way is valid, and that's the cool thing about the Hebrew language, as you know, is that you can interpret these things in so many different ways with multiple levels of meaning. Yes.
I think it's also helpful to compare other places where God or gods is referred to in the Torah. I've been listening to the book of Deuteronomy in King James Audio Bible, and it keeps saying over and over, the Lord your God, the Lord your God, the Lord your God does this, the Lord your God does that. And I'm thinking, it's like, well, that's weird. Those are both generic terms. If you were to translate that directly back into the Hebrew, Lord is Baal, and then God is El. So
Well,
is it saying Baal El, Baal El?
Well, it's actually the Lord your God, translated in the King James, is actually Yehovah Elohim.
Exactly. So,
But Yehovah is actually a proper noun and not Lord.
right, exactly. So the translation is bad. They've taken a specific name and made it a generic title.
Right.
So if you compare it, it does not say created by Yehovah Elohim. It says created by Elohim. So there, we should make the distinction there.
Yeah.
And, so that's one.
Interesting insight. Absolutely.
And also you can have the Aleph Tav thing. So it doesn't just say created by Elohim. It says created by Elohim Aleph Tav.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit more.
Yeah.
there to take
Absolutely.
from.
It's a mystery for sure.
But the verb is.
But the verb is singular, first person.
Yeah.
Somebody did it. One of these godheads. And I think
And then that comes back to the we are one thing,
we are.
and that's
yeah.
what we have. It's hard for us to comprehend.
That is really, really challenging
And
for
he's
us.
trying to say from the very beginning that he just defies explanation.
That is right. He defies explanation right from the beginning.
Well,
Father and one.
in the Old Testament, there are listed a few other gods.
Mhm.
That's
And
true.
There's also listed a bunch of false gods. They talk about idols that are made out of wood
Yeah.
and stuff,
Yeah.
but there are other gods that are actually named.
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
Ashtaroth,
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
Tammuz.
Mhm.
There are a few gods that are actually named.
Yeah. And I have wondered about that at times, and I don't know. Well, there are also a couple of places where he mentions that this is most likely demon worship. That I think that these are mighty ones, which are actually demons.
Well, they're all created beings.
They're all
certainly.
created beings,
Certainly.
absolutely.
But
So,
they could still be spirit beings
Yeah.
that are worshipped.
and they have,
That's what the devil is. That's
Sure.
what Satan is.
Yeah. and they certainly have power.
Yeah.
They're more powerful than humans, as far as we know at this point in our incarnation, at least. And so, yeah, there's certain, especially in the land of Canaan, it's the purpose for us. When I say us, I mean our ancestors going in there and wiping them out, taking them out and destroying them off of the face of the planet because they had corrupted themselves beyond what is acceptable.
Also, if you read in Enoch, it discusses various hosts of heaven, various angels who were given authority over this area and over that area and over that area.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, you can
they're-
see that in the
they're
book of
created
Daniel.
beings, but they're over various things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Given stewardship.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good principle that you can see in the book of Exodus when Yethro comes forward and says, "Hey Moses, you shouldn't be handling all this stuff yourself. You really need to delegate some authority." I think that's teaching us a spiritual principle, and that God does delegate authority Himself. Anne?
I just have two more things before we move to the second verse. I wasn't sure if we before.
Yes, please.
So one thing I find interesting is the word bara,
Yes.
created.
Yes.
And that word is actually used in the first verse, and then it's only used when the humans were created
That's
and
right.
when the sea creatures were created.
That's right.
So
Don't go
I
too
can't
far.
wait.
Don't go too far with that, because we're going there. We're
Right,
going
I
there.
just wanna, I don't know what's too far is, but I think it's a very important to understand the rest.
Yeah.
That I believe the heavens and the earth were created, and then when it comes to the 6 days, they were called out. They were Elohim made them, which is a different word,
Yes.
and which means to appoint, to call out.
Right. Right.
But yeah, is
No,
that
yeah,
what
that's
you
yeah.
want
We're definitely gonna get into that because like bara is like ex nihilo, creating something out of nothing. But then that word is only used in a couple of spots. The rest of them is asa,
Right.
which is like fashioning, moving things around, organizing
even
things.
let there be light
Is not
calling
actually-
out. Does
yeah, it's
that
a
mean
calling
he
out.
Created
Right.
it, or did he create it there?
That's a
and he
good,
called it out?
yeah, good point. Good
And
point.
yeah, and it also means to fatten.
Mm.
And I had to think about, and I don't know if someone else it came to mind. For me, it came a little bit to mind, like pregnancy, like the conception is when the human being is created, but then it takes time in the womb to form, and it's actually also created without form.
Interesting.
And then it later in pregnancy, the form is, or things are so called
Yeah,
out if
yeah.
you so want to.
Well,
see
those are
that.
some
So-
excellent insights into these words, and that's that's coming right up here that we want to discuss. What did actually God create, and what did He fashion? Because there are key differences here. Carla.
Just to tag on to that, when you hear the description of the earth and the waters around it, it is like a womb with the waters,
Yeah.
just like a
Yeah.
child would be.
Yeah.
Good way.
And it might be without the shape, but it doesn't say that it's lifeless.
Right.
So when he's speaking and calling, he's calling these things and giving them function.
Right.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
And the other thing is that I wanted to point out is, I didn't read all the questions, but I didn't see it in the next questions, is what do people believe here? Was that the same day when he said, let there be light? Or was that a previous day? Because it says in Genesis 2 verse 4 that he created he created them, he made them in one day.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's an interesting.
That's yeah, and we're going to discuss that further because and
that
that's
comes further too.
yeah, that's coming up. That's coming up. There's so many questions here. There's so many questions here. But one of the first things that I want to look at is what came right here in chapter 1 verse 2. And some of you have probably done some research into this, and maybe you've looked at it and you've rejected it, or maybe you've looked at it and you've embraced it. And I wanted to contemplate for just a moment the difference between this Hebrew word, the 1961, haitah, and this has several implications. Most of your English translation says the earth was empty and void. But that is one possible translation. But if you look in your Strong's Literal Concordance or your Brown Driver Briggs, you'll actually see that in most cases, that word haitah is actually translated as not as was, but is becoming, or became, which is a different form of the verb, and frankly has some interesting implications. For example, if you translate it like the literal does, and the Darby translation and the Young's literal translation, you can see that it actually says, "Yet the earth became an empty wasteland, or formless and void." Or you've probably heard somebody talk about tohu and vohu, formless and void. Now, what's interesting about that is that some people have proposed a gap theory. Are you familiar with the gap theory? Any show of hands who is not familiar with the gap theory? You are not familiar with the gap theory? Okay. All right. No, that's fine. That's fine. Well, let me just as a point of trivia. How many of you are buying it? How many of you are actually giving credence to the gap theory and thinking that actually could work? Okay. Oh no, don't. We don't have to. We're not.
Because in the church, gap theory. Means
I know, and you've jumped the gun because I was just about to say, for those listening on the internet or maybe even some people here, don't freak out. We're not talking about evolution at all. This has nothing to do with evolution. Did God create the earth? Absolutely. Did God create humans on the planet approximately 6,000 years ago? Yes. Very clearly. Is the earth 6,000 years old? Probably not. Probably not. That is a theory, and we'll take a look at a couple of places in Scripture and frankly the base text here to talk about that a little bit. Because this seems to say in the Hebrew with the most common, what would be a most common translation, is that God created the heavens and the earth, but they became an empty wasteland. How? And why? And when? It's a good question.
There's a lot of details missing there.
There's a lot of details missing there.
That's just really one interpretation, because I also looked at the grammar, and it is also can be translated as was, and I think more likely it's translated as was, and plus it's also
No, I totally understand.
So before we assume that there,
and I know I don't want to. We're not going to assume anything. We're just going to discuss this theory and some other scriptures that some people have tied together to see about this, and maybe we can come to our own conclusions, and may the Spirit of God guide us. But we'll take a look at it, Tracy.
Yeah, I don't think that basing that whole theory on that word is a good.
No, that would not work.
another interesting thing about this word is, the thing is about this word, 1961, is it is translated so many different ways, so many different times.
Mhm.
You can even look at the name when Yahweh says, I am who I am. You'll see that word.
Mhm.
So but it's not the same. It's a little bit different.
Sure.
And here we've got the hey at the end, so basically it's making it female. So the
Right.
earth she was without form and void. So
Right.
make it the female.
So male would be Haita or Haita or Haya, which is
And this same word is used when it says he named her Eve and she became the mother of all living.
Right.
It can be became, but it can also be was. I was just gonna say I don't think that that's the best
you wouldn't
argument there.
And
That's
and
what
I'm not making that argument. And people who hold to the gap theory are definitely not making the argument. There's a gap here just because you could
Yeah.
possibly translate this.
And let
word
me just
as
say, I
become.
have not shut the door on that theory. I think that it's quite possible. But
I
not
think
because
it's
of that word.
yeah, and I think it's interesting, and it bears some intelligent thought and consideration. And I'm not saying it's the truth, but it's an interesting idea that we'll just take a look at.
Well, the question isn't really.
Oh no, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll be quick. The question isn't really asked here. It's more asked in Jeremiah, I think it is.
Yeah.
I've
That's
got
one of them, yeah.
I've got the Reese Chronological Bible where this guy, he tries to take all the scriptures and put them chronologically, not by book,
Right.
but by verse.
Sure.
And the way he does it is he has the first verse and then he jumps to Jeremiah, because in Jeremiah it talks about, I don't know if it was about the Prince of Tyre or something, but it basically says,
I think it was the
"You who-"
Assyrians coming in to destroy the northern tribes of Israel.
Well, it says, "You who brought the mountains low, you who made the earth a wasteland."
Mm-hmm.
And so when you read this, you're thinking, when did this happen? This
Yeah.
is written in Jeremiah. This
Sure.
is referring to a historical event.
Yeah.
What historical event is this talking about?
Right.
And it's referring, I think it's the same passage about Lucifer falling or
Mhm,
Satan falling. So that's where the question comes up. When you
Right.
say, wait a minute, when were the mountains brought low?
Right.
When were all the nations destroyed?
Yeah, and I mean, that's always the question, right? If Satan fell, when did that fall happen?
When did that
He was
happen?
obviously there
Yeah.
tempting and being evil there in the garden in
Sure.
the beginning.
Sure.
It says he fell to the earth.
Right.
And his fall to the earth is not
Well,
in
that's-
Genesis.
That's
as far as
right.
we
That's
know.
right. That's right. It's not. At least it's not described there, but there does seem to be some reference to it in Jeremiah. Did you want to make another comment? You want to take a look at? There are two other passages which relate to this tohu and vohu, and that we can take a look at. Did you want to bring something else into the conversation?
Yeah, or you guys can go ahead if it matches.
Yeah, it fits in with
Yeah,
this whole thing.
yeah.
So let's take a look at Isaiah 45.
So is this part of the gap theory?
Yes, yes. So if you take a look at Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18. And this is a curious thing. Isaiah 45:18 says, "For thus says Yehovah, the creator of the heavens, he is Elohim and former of the earth and its maker, and he established it. He did not create it a chaos. He formed it to be inhabited. I am Yehovah, and there is none else." So that's one passage where it uses the same Hebrew word for chaos. Void, tohu. Yes.
But it also says create and made it. And that process, like I compare it to the conception and the womb, where at conception it is formless, the baby, but then it's made, right? And when it is time to give birth, then it is not void anymore.
Right.
And so, and he uses the word made here as well in what you just read. And formed and made it. And so this forming and making process took place in those 6 days. So that's why I don't think, I heard that before, is when people say, well, Elohim wouldn't create something that was tohu vabohu, but it wasn't, the creation wasn't finished in that first, in this first sentence.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And I think, Tracy?
I
Sorry?
do want to point out the meaning of that word.
Which one?
Void, though, tohu.
Tohu?
So it says, and he created the earth, and it was tohu, which is formless, confusion, worthless, nothing. Did he create it that way? That's what I have a hard time with. And like the argument with like Satan falling, where does that fit into this equation? It's just something that.
No, I totally understand. I do. And, I think that what you're talking about with the Hebrew word bara, saying in Isaiah, I created it. He's saying, I am the former of the earth and its maker, and he established it. He did not create it in the chaos. He formed it to be inhabitable. I think that gap theory proponents would say, yeah, that happened in verse 1. He created it in the beginning, and it was perfect, and it was inhabitable, but something happened. Don't know what, but that's what they're proposing. One other thing that you can, and you pointed this out a minute ago, was this section in Jeremiah. Let's go ahead and take a look at that in Jeremiah chapter 4.
4?
Yeah, Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. And this is talking about destruction being proclaimed. He says, I looked to the land, and behold, waste and void. It's the same words, tohu and vohu. And unto the heavens, and there is no light. I looked to the mountains, and behold, they are trembling, and all the hills moved themselves lightly. I looked, and behold, there is no man, and all the birds of the heavens have fled. I have looked, and behold, the fruitful place is a wilderness, and all its cities have been broken down, because of the fierceness of his anger. For thus said Yehovah, all the land is a desolation, but a completion I make not. For this does the land mourn, and black have been the heavens above, because I have spoken, I have purposed, I have not repented, nor do I turn back from it. So it's another passage that talks about this tohu and vohu stuff, which seems to be describing, well, if you look at the context previously, it's talking about Jerusalem being besieged, and this is obviously, in a very real sense, just from the context, talking about the Assyrians coming to destroy, either that or the Babylonians, I apologize, coming to destroy the land of Judah. But it's using some colorful language about massive destruction and earth's, the mountains trembling and complete blackness and all the animals being dead, which is like, that's certainly not the case when you look at the historical context. And so some people have suggested, well, this is another iteration of this prophecy that Jeremiah is seeing. That this is a smaller incarnation, if you will, of what had happened in the beginning because of the fall of Satan. Some people have proposed that this is another instance of that. So let me just say this. From a practical standpoint, one other thing that these people who believe in the gap theory will propose is, there's we were talking previously about the words asa and bara, okay, about whether he created something out of nothing or whether he's fashioning things. And you mentioned earlier, that when it says the word bara, which means to create something out of nothing, is not actually used until later. And what's curious, and I underlined the passage here that you can see in verse 11 where it says that God is saying, let's bring forth the greenery and the herbs, bringing forth their seed and such. Well, what's interesting in verse 11, if you read that in Hebrew, most translations will say that the fruit tree has its seed in it. But the text in the Hebrew does not actually say that. It says the seed is in the earth. The seed is already in the earth, which is one of the little, theories that they are proposing. to help point to, well, that this gap theory might have some legs. So what they're saying essentially is God created the heaven and the earth. Some terrible catastrophe happened, and it was destroyed. Either he destroyed it himself or through some type of war or something, it became a chaos and void and empty, utterly destroyed. And some eons later, he began to recreate. Restore, I think, would be the term that they would use, they would prefer. He's not creating here in anything after verse 1. In verse 1, he created everything. Verse 2 is letting us know things went horribly wrong somehow, and he is restoring. He is restoring the creation and putting things in their place, and that's why it says in the description of what is actually created out of nothing starts with the animals, because they were all dead. The seeds from the plants that had existed before were already in the earth, and that they just needed to have the waters removed and exposed, the earth exposed again to sunlight, and they would begin to grow, which is actually what the Hebrew text says, which is interesting. And again, I'm not promoting this theory. I'm simply throwing it out there because it's become quite popular and people are talking about it. What are the practical implications, okay? This does not have anything to do with evolution. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that God did indeed create the earth. And it really, the only thing that is curious to me is, because I have a degree in history and I studied history, especially I really enjoyed, it was one area of my specialty, was ancient history. And you can see quite clearly in any history book you pick up that the history of humanity only goes back, as far as we can tell, to the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And that only goes back to about 3,500 years ago. Before that, there seems to be nothing in the historical record.
You mean 3,500 BC?
No, I'm talking 3,500 years ago, because of the flood. In my estimation, looking at it from a historical perspective of the flood having come and wipe out everything in the time of Noah, that they began to rebuild this civilization in the land of Shinar, which is exactly where Mesopotamia is. And that's where you get the first recorded history of human civilization, is in the Mesopotamian river valley, which is curious because if the earth is, according to scientists, millions and billions of years old, well, it appears that man is not that old because there's no recorded history. Yes, you can find bones or something that maybe scientists will say, this bone is 20,000 years old. Well, that's fine and good, but you won't find any real historical evidence of humanity, which it doesn't go back that far. So I thought that was always curious. However, when you start to dating rocks and the strata of this and that, they start saying billions of years. Well, the proponents of the gap theory are saying, well, that all makes perfect sense, and it frankly causes us no problems. If God created the earth and then Satan fell, or who knows what happened, and the earth became formless and void for maybe an extended period of time. It could have been billions of years. And then he goes and he begins to rearrange things and put things back together, and he creates man on the earth approximately 6,000 years ago. Does that give me heartburn? No. Frankly, it doesn't bother me at all. It doesn't affect my theology. I know God created the earth, and I know that earth is, who knows how old the earth is. I have no idea, but I know that man's tenure on this planet is not terribly old. But is it incumbent upon me to, well, let me rephrase that. Like I said, I don't have a problem with it. That theory, the gap theory, I can't prove it. I think that there's some interesting textual evidence. I think if you were trying to reconcile the Bible and science, well, that might come in handy to say, yeah, well, the earth is obviously really old, and the gap theory says that. Well, that's going to get you off the back of the scientists, and you might be able to get along with your science friends. However, does that change the theology? Not really.
It also says in a beginning. So the gap theory kind of assumes that there were two beginnings, right? There was a beginning and then something happened, and then there was a recreation, another beginning. And the other thing can also be it is Bereshit really means in a beginning, meaning before that beginning there could have been also.
Sure.
another
And I
beginning
think that
and
you make a
age
good
of
point.
things that have happened.
You make a good point because this is a beginning for humanity, but frankly, in the book of Revelation, there's another new beginning. The heaven and the earth is completely destroyed by fire this time. You know, it's also interesting when you look at the book of 1 Peter, when Peter says, out of the water, the earth, they failed to recognize that the earth was destroyed by water.
Totally.
He doesn't actually mention Noah in that section, which is curious. Just throwing it out there. But the current heavens and earth are preserved for fire, so that the earth is going to be completely destroyed by fire and recreated. So there we have another restoration. It wouldn't, like I said, it doesn't throw me off if we're talking about a gap theory. That's fine. If you'd like it, take it, research it, look into it, see if you think it works. If you don't, throw it out.
It's not horribly relevant.
It's not terribly, terribly relevant. It is a curiosity. Like I said, if you see other theological problems with it, then I don't know what that would be. Some people have said, well, it's been appointed unto man once to die. Well, who says there were men on the planet? It doesn't say that. Or, that there was no death. I don't know.
Just to tie up the gap theory can of worms, the other thing people look to is the book of Job. Job is a little curious. Job is apparently a very important guy. God calls him out and says, this is the most righteous man on the earth, apparently. And yet you don't see him in the genealogies. The question is, what's the deal with Job? Who were his parents? Who were his children? And other things in Job are curious.
There's a lot of curious stuff in Job.
Being that people believe it to be the oldest story.
Yeah.
Secondly, it talks about the devil just walking around the planet, which, in the garden, doesn't say anything about him falling. He's just there. Whereas, and also it talks about the sons of God, and God has like a council where the sons of God come and they present themselves to him, which is another place where the term Elohim may come from. God has a council that shows up, and the devil comes up too, being an angel. So maybe the rest of these sons of God are angels, most likely.
Yeah.
But that's the other reason people wonder about the gap theory, because they're saying, where does Job fall in the timeline?
Right.
I don't think Job was a real character, he was a story.
You think he's a fiction?
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of wondering
Really?
too.
Yeah. I think it was too
Some people, I think that people really have a problem with the book of Job and would like to allegorize it and say that couldn't possibly be real. It's just teaching us some moral lessons, is because you've got God allowing the devil to mess with Job.
Right.
That is what causes
Look at the
people.
planet. God allowed a lot of people to mess with it.
I have a question to you with the gap theory. So, do the gap theory people believe that man was created and then recreated
No.
on the sixth day?
No.
I thought that
Not
what
as far
you
as
mean
I've
with
never
Job is
seen
that
it.
he was like.
Oh no, I don't think is that was I don't believe that was a connection you were making, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean...
That Job was one of these people, like,
who
from
believe-
before or something?
People who believe the gap theory... Oh, yes.
Oh,
They
okay.
would believe that Job is people. I think some people who believe in the gap theory would believe that Job was a member of an earlier creation.
Oh, okay. I had never heard that
That's what I
before.
heard. That's why I'm
Okay.
asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had
That's what
never
they-
heard that
But
before.
he
believe.
does use the word bara again when he created mankind. So
Yeah,
it
I'm not
doesn't-
necessarily a believer in the gap theory. I'm just saying why people
Yeah.
begin to ask those questions.
Yeah. It's certainly fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. It's very interesting.
If you're bored, God's given us plenty of things to argue,
will never die.
discuss.
To argue about, to discuss.
Yes,
Yeah.
He created everything
Longer, but it's
and
like,
then.
you can't say
That's
that.
the
Yeah.
other thing. The
You
first,
can't.
the second verse is ba, right? So it says and.
Right.
So
Right. It's certainly
tying two
curious.
things together.
Yeah.
It's kind of like and there.
Right. It's certainly curious, and yeah, it's an interesting theory, and frankly, I got no problem with it one way or the other. I don't need to argue with scientists about how old the Earth is. It doesn't really matter to me. I just know that God created it, He ordained it, He created man on it, and He gave us instructions on how we should walk. End of story for me. As far as whether there was a gap in between there and the Earth is actually billions of years old because something terrible happened, I don't know. It's certainly interesting. Carla?
Just a question, because as we're talking about this, throughout the Word, there are so many times that the Lord uses idioms in that cultural idioms to explain things. And as Westerners, we tend to look at things so literal, and He doesn't mean it literally. It's like, I might say, I got so mad I hit the ceiling to a culture that's not here. And maybe it's a European culture, and they might go, why would she hit the ceiling if she's mad? Does she get on a ladder and do that? Or does she really pound it? Or does she just tap it? There's all these ways to try to understand idioms. And I don't know. I'm just thinking, is there any evidence of idioms being used here that really mean something else?
It's a good question. That's a good question to think about. I don't know. That would be something that we'd have to do a little bit more research on. And frankly, I think that what would be the? We'll finish up this discussion about this tohu and vohu and the gap theory with this one question that I have for you. And what would be the upside or the downside to believing this one way or the other? Is there a downside or an upside? Does it affect anything? I know this seems like a fruitless discussion, which is totally speculative, which doesn't make any difference one way or the other. But I'm asking you the question, does it make one difference one way or the other? Is there any upside or downside? Or are we just talking about fluff and it doesn't really matter and we should just kick this to the curb and move on?
I think you mentioned it kind of. I never heard about it, so it's totally new to me. It's interesting that the communication with scientists, atheists. I have a problem always with talking with my dad, for example, and like talking to a hardcore atheist. Saying, okay, let's throw science out of the door.
Sure.
Maybe that's the only pro.
Okay, that's a good.
I don't think it has any bearing.
That's a good point. What do you got?
Our kids.
What do you mean?
To tell them absolutely it was created in 6 literal days, the normal thing I was told, and that anything else is
Blasphemy.
right. And then they get to college age, and they get that other information thrown at them, and they see dinosaur bones and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden, that thing you told me doesn't look to be true.
They look
I
like
see a
an
lot
idiot.
of evidence that you're wrong in this area, and I think from there it crumbles, and they think you're wrong. You could be wrong about everything, and just the idea of not being so
Rigid.
into, so painted into a corner with this, that you would tell your kids, look, this is what some people think, this is what, like you just said, could be this, could be that, don't know.
Is that a mountain you want to die on? Yeah, to teach your children that God created the heavens and the earth and the universe and everything that exists in 6 literal days, and that was about 6,000 years ago.
And assuming that we understand God's mind, and that this, that's the thing, is that, and that's probably why they missed Messiah the first time, is when you start thinking you know everything. Just keeping your mind open to, he's much smarter than me. I see this here and I see this, I lean this way, I lean that way, fine. But to tell people and to get, I think it's a mistake.
Mike, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Okay.
I just think it also says that it's like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So it could be 6,000 years.
Yeah.
Of
And that
creation.
would still be scriptural, right?
Yeah,
So
you
I
could
wouldn't
interpret
leave
it that
up
way.
to everything, like whatever, because I think Elohim is specific when he says day, and it does mean something.
Sure,
So I wouldn't
sure.
take that away. It says don't add and don't take away from scripture.
Right.
But again, it doesn't need to be a literal day.
Sure,
It could have
sure.
been like
And I think if all of us here have learned anything, is that we don't know anything. That we have really had to re-examine some foundational principles that we were holding fast to our whole lives, and we're suddenly discovering, wait a minute, a lot of stuff that we believed, we just got completely flipped around on its head when we actually read our Bibles and thought that it doesn't actually say that, So we if nothing else, we should be cognizant of the fact that we really know nothing, and we really should not be dogmatic in saying, this is what it says. Well, it can say anything you want it to say if you're willing to twist the words enough. What the point is, can we get to the absolute truth on this matter? No, we can't. I don't believe that there's enough data here for us to make a determination. It is not written that way to say, yeah, we're not going to be able to walk away from this saying that's the truth. And frankly, it is just these areas that God leaves with a little bit of gray painted in there. Frankly, and I have said this repeatedly, it's those areas where you can see gray in the Bible that God is testing you about whether you will be fellowshipping with your brethren when you begin to disagree about things. There are hard and fast truths where he says, thou shalt and thou shalt not.
Yeah.
Those are the hard and fast truths that we need to agree upon. But then there are gray areas, and it's especially true with some different theories about certain things which are not explicit in the text. Like, calendar issues are notorious. I mean, the Hebrew roots movement is just being decimated by calendar issues. When is this day, and when is that day, and when does the day begin, and when does the month begin, and when is the Pesach?
I call a different group, and just mentioning the calendar, they begin to get a little hostile. It's like,
And you know what? And I have said it, and I'll say it just one more time for good measure. Those are issues where God is testing us. Are we going to fight with each other and kick each other to the curb and not be able to fellowship with one another because we want to argue about things that, frankly, you can't prove one way or the other? You really can't. And I've looked at I have studied the calendar issues for years, and I've seen good arguments from everyone. Good ones from everyone. They have great points, and they contradict each other all the time. And I can't come to a conclusion. I just can't.
But I think the Sabbath is one of those thou shalt.
Thou shalt observe the Sabbath.
So
yes,
there,
indeed.
when it comes to the calendar and the Sabbath, I do believe this is critical.
The Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath is
like
critical.
There's a gray zone and nobody can know.
That's right.
I mean,
Well, that's the whole nature of the calendar issues. Thou shalt have a Sabbath. You shall observe the Sabbath. You shall observe the Passover. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks. You shall observe Shavuot. But if nobody can agree on when they are.
well, everything in the scriptures is critical. They talk about the important stuff and the unimportant stuff. There are no unimportant things. Everything
True.
the Bible discusses is important.
Sure.
But the question is, how important is my interpretation? How much pride am I going to place in my interpretation? How graceful am I going to be with people who disagree?
Sure.
That's the important
I think
part.
that's
So, of course,
that's
it's
critical.
important. I agree. It's
Yeah.
all important. Every detail is important. But smart people disagree.
Smart people disagree. They do. Keith?
Can't we just celebrate them all?
He told
Celebrate
us what
them
he
all.
wants us to know, and there is more.
Celebrate all the feast days or celebrate multiple feast days every day?
Do all the feast days, and then you'll be covered.
You watching the day you think I'm coming, I'm not coming, or something like that.
I think there's an awakening.
every day.
Hey, there you go. Well, then you wouldn't be fulfilling the commandment, thou shalt work for 6 days.
I would say there is an awakening, and the awakening is going in a direction. So, like they call it the Ephraim awakening, the Hebrew roots, the Torah movement.
Yeah.
There is almost a disclosure. I know the scripture talks about something that I've heard called divine censorship, is basically where God makes certain things shrouded in confusion. So you can see it, I think it's in Isaiah where it says, having ears they won't hear, having eyes they won't comprehend. It's the same thing, Jesus alludes to it, that specifically the Jews were hidden from recognizing him because otherwise they would not have killed him. So,
Right.
but I think that, so we see that God does shroud things in darkness for a time, and now as we see the Ephraim coming back, we see Revelation coming out. It is in a certain direction. So I think that the calendar is becoming more and more of an issue every day on purpose. It's becoming of importance because, I mean, when you look at the Gregorian calendar, I mean, look, when someone says month, it means month. That's what it's referring to. Monday means moon day. So, and if you look at our months are about, 29, 30, 31 days, which is about the moon cycle. Our months are about the length of a moon cycle. So everybody knows that before we had watches, like I've got a watch here and it has in it a quartz crystal, most likely, that it pulsates, sends an electrical charge into it, and the quartz crystal just apparently it pulsates at the same rate. That's why they use it for a watch. So it's completely arbitrary. They just chose, and before they had electricity, how were they telling time? Well, they were checking their Google homepage to find what day it was at the time. Of course not. They were using the sun, the moon, the stars.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying the revelation is moving that way, and the calendar issues are important, especially if there was some kind of catastrophic downtime of the electrical grid. Or if you even desert on a desert, if you're on a desert island and been in a coma for a week, you would have no idea what day it was without an understanding of the luminaries and
Sure.
the sun and
And
stars.
frankly, with us being dependent upon technology and having gotten away from, agricultural society, we have no clue what's going on out there in the universe and how to calculate time. And we have gotten far removed from that. And I think that you are right, that is important. And I think for right now, it continues to grow in importance. As far as how it's going to be resolved, God's going to have to do that.
Yeah.
Because that's one of those things where we were all reading our Bibles thinking we had it all figured out, and then all of a sudden somebody said, are you sure? You might want to look over here. And we look at it and like, duh, how did I miss that? And then it's just like popping up all over the place. God may do that with the calendar. He's going to have to, because frankly we're all discombobulated about how to figure out what is the day begin and when does the month begin and when is Passover. Yeah, there's all kinds of confusion.
Well, I think it talks about the millennial reign also. It says that it refers to the progression of time, and it says from new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
So it's referring to there being Sabbaths and new moons in the after.
Sure,
Right.
absolutely.
And you can even see it with them when God reintroduces himself to the people after they came out of Egypt, because they were using, an Egyptian calendar, I'm sure. They were following an
Makes
Egyptian
sense.
way of looking
Sure.
at time, and you can see him reintroducing them to the way he tells time.
Yeah.
Specifically with Jericho, that's one people mention a lot for the lunar Sabbath, where they so he was teaching them, and he actually said to them, this will be the beginning of months for you, this will be the beginning of your year. So you can see how he would reintroduce us to the calendar. If it's not the Gregorian calendar, which, what are the chances that his calendar is the Gregorian?
Yeah.
Pretty slim.
What's the date on the Hebrew calendar?
5777.
Well, even the Hebrew calendar.
They know that that's wrong.
Because they took, 400 years out of it, just because they didn't happen to like those 400 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to see the Hebrew calendar right now, how the Jews proclaim it. There's also a lot of man-made tradition mixed in.
Yeah.
Well, and frankly, here we are, a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys here, just learning about the fact that the Torah is actually valid at all. And, the Jews have gotten themselves discombobulated, wrapped around the axle on several issues. But, here we come, these Johnny-come-latelys who are starting to keep their calendar, and we're going to tell them how to keep their calendar. And I'm not saying they've got it right. I know they don't, and they know they don't. They themselves know that they don't have it right. But we need to be humble, and we need to wait to hear what God has to say. I know that there's a ton of calendar issues, and frankly, I want us to be able to fellowship and get along, and we can discuss calendar issues all day long, as we're not, getting hard and fast and saying you're wrong and you got a problem here. That's where I have to draw the line and say, look, man, plenty of good people are disagreeing about these things, and that's just not something we want to do, is tear ourselves apart talking about calendar issues.
Don't even look at one.
Don't even look at a calendar.
Whenever the 50th year Jubilee, however the calendar lays out, we want to know when that is.
Well, yeah, that's another issue. Nobody seems to be able to, you can't, if you're not figuring this stuff out and knowing when the calendar is actually, you don't know when the Shemitah year is, you don't know when the Jubilee year is, you can't, not that, what are we going to get people to release our debts and set us free from slavery? I don't know. That's not going to happen until Yeshua arrives, but there's a lot of calendar issues. And, I encourage you, look into them, research them, find out what it says.
You have to remember, too, that the Torah is first and foremost spiritual.
Yes.
So we can follow these laws hard and fast all we want, but if we're not gaining any spiritual connection to the Father or any spiritual insight, It's not going to do you any good.
That is an excellent point. And we know that that's what our Jewish brothers and sisters were doing in the time of Yeshua, is holding hard and fast to the rules of how they had interpreted the Bible and got themselves all wrapped around the axle and missed the Messiah.
Yeah.
I know, I was hoping to talk about some of that spiritual darkness light here, but we're not
Well,
going to get to it.
yeah, it's looking like we're sorry. I apologize. This always happens, there's too much to talk about. Maybe I'll finish my first page. Let's just have a look here. Sorry. Yeah, that was my next question, is this darkness, Kosek, Hebrew 28:22, that is on the submerged chaos. And what does that represent? That is a fascinating little passage when you look at those Hebrew words, especially Kosek. Do you have the definition for that, Tracy?
Yeah, darkness, misery, destruction, death, ignorance, sorrow, wickedness, night, obscurity. That's from the Strong's.
Yeah, and frankly, that's rather curious, isn't it?
Well, there's a passage that I think goes along with this in Isaiah 45, which is where we were reading before.
Tell us.
Verse 7, where it says, I form the light, which is the same word light, and create bara, darkness, which is the same word darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the equation or whatever, that's something that matches with it. So I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I Yahweh do all these things. So me reading that, I think he's equating light to peace and dark to evil.
Fair characterization. Yeah, the words. Go ahead.
I wanted to add to this. I mean, darkness represents the kingdom of Satan, or it says like also in we are children of light and not of darkness, and of the day and not of night or of darkness. Or it also equals darkness to unrighteousness and light to righteousness. So they are pretty much opposites.
Right, absolutely.
Not to be too much of a troublemaker, but
I'm going to do it anyway.
I'm going to do it
You
anyway.
might be saying what I was about to say. Let's see.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just throw it out there. I mean, so first the devil is being an angel of light. Okay, so there's that.
Okay.
But also, God is shrouded in the cloud at the top of the mountain.
That's exactly where Tracy was going.
Yeah, not a normal cloud, a dark cloud.
That's
Psalm
right.
18:11 says he made darkness his secret place.
That's
his
right.
pavilion round about him.
Yeah.
And even the word evil, it says in the Bible that God did evil, like he planned evil against certain things. Or even he says he repented of the evil he had planned in other places. So
that's an interesting thing that you just said, because when King David was planning to number the people, in 1 Kings, it says that Satan approached him to tempt him to number the people, but in 1 Chronicles it says God tempted him. Apparent contradiction in the scripture. Unless, of course, you realize that God is sovereign.
Does it say Elohim or does
Yeah.
it say Yahweh?
No, it says Yehovah. So unless you realize that God is sovereign and that the devil has a function to perform, just as Angela was talking about last week, with the devil has a function to perform. He is created to be your adversary so that you have something to fight against. It's like resistance training. He was created for that purpose, apparently, although maybe he himself didn't realize it, kind of like Pharaoh, was created for such a time and such, but, I'm sure he didn't agree. But, the devil is a tool. I don't mean that in a colloquial sense that we would use that term, but he is a tool that our God uses for training and instruction in righteousness. It's just he's a tool, and he uses him in that way. So what's interesting about this darkness is, you can apply all kinds of interesting metaphorical ideas regarding salvation and being in darkness and coming into light, and the kingdom of darkness versus the kingdom of light. And you go to the book of Enoch, it's got a lot about the sons of darkness and the sons of light, and the scrolls in the Qumran caves have sons of darkness and sons of light. There's so much about that. Keith?
So talking about the light, so if we go back and we talk about how he was on the face of the deep and it was dark and the face of the waters, and then let there be light, there was light. Now there's no celestial bodies, there's no sun or moon. The light is emanating from him.
That is certainly seems to be the case from a rabbinic perspective. They believe that as well, is that God is
that
light.
From his tabernacle? I mean, his tabernacle's hovering there. I mean, you know.
It's some, you know, some of the rabbis have said that God basically just revealed himself when he said, "Let there be light," and that his own radiance began to emanate, and that it needed to be restricted.
But it also says he called that light day. I don't know if God or Yeshua is called day, and then that light goes
Well, we were
down.
in dark,
as
we were in complete darkness in the womb there, and then a light came on, so that was day.
But
and
that's
then
why
it
I
was,
said.
Well, Yeshua is called the
Who
day
says
star.
that the light wasn't created before, but then it was called out.
Yeah.
And later on, it was appointed, or the luminaries were appointed to carry that light or whatever. So it doesn't need to be the spiritual light, because the spiritual light is in Revelation 21 when it says there's no need of a sun or moon anymore, because he will be the light and there will be no night anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That is a different type of light that doesn't like shine for 12 hours and then goes away.
And I think that's what this light is here. It's the light from the beginning. The end from the beginning is being determined. It's a nice little bookend. It's like, and the glory of God is the light. The Lamb is the light. He was in the beginning with God. And this whole picture here of the darkness on the face of the deep, the waters representing the people, because waters are called people frequently. And then the light coming forth, let there be light. The people who sat in darkness saw a great light. This is Messiah, it's Messianic right here. And what's really cool about this is if you go to Matthew 14, when he goes out to the disciples in the night, they say, "It is a spirit." So the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. The light of God came to them in the dark. I just think that's such an amazing picture of Messiah.
Hold on, Angela?
We're thinking about light as what you can see with your human eye.
The light spectrum?
But on the electromagnetic spectrum, light is a tiny little section of all those different energy waves, and I think we might be missing something if we keep, I think there's something there with literal light and literal dark, the way our human eyes see it, but this whole thing about just energy and matter, and this huge physics thing that's going on right here when we're reading about this, that he is that energy, the visible and the invisible, all those wavelengths.
And I think it bears in mind repeating, like we always do, is the answer A, B, or C? Yes, it is. So we're talking about visible light. We're talking about invisible light. We're talking about spiritual light. Aunt June, hold on.
Yeah, I was saying, when the word refers to light, it means a lot of different things.
Can mean a lot of different things, yeah. There's so many metaphors that you can apply to light.
You can't just take it and stick it in one thing. You have to read, what does it pertain to in that thing? Because Christ is the light. The Word is the light as a lamp into our feet and a word into our path.
Right.
Light means a lot of things. You can't take it and stick it in one little dumb category.
And I think it helps us spiritually to stick it into all categories and see how it fits. And you see the implications of it from so many different perspectives, and it then provides much deeper meaning when you plug it into all areas that it could potentially fit. Tracy?
There's this really cool, in my mind anyway, a really cool picture here, again, a Messianic picture of the spiritual light in day 1 and the physical light in day 4, because day 4, 4,000 years, when Messiah came in the flesh, the physical light. So I think that that's really cool to see, like, the spiritual light, the word is spirit. We need to understand that spiritual aspect, but then the physical light comes into play. So something that you can see.
Yes.
It's something that your eyes can see.
Right.
And that's what Messiah came into the world, is the word made flesh.
Yeah, good insight, good insight. Was someone else had something that they wanted to throw out there? What's that?
No, that was exactly my problem also when I read there's light before day 4.
Okay, yeah.
I agree with you that both of you.
Yeah, there's amazing mysteries here, and some of them are pure conjecture, which are, may not have spiritual value, but a lot of them will if you look at them from a different perspective. You can see spiritual principles involved, which I think is
I think
fascinating.
it's really just tying in the fact that the Word was there. God's Word was there in the beginning. And the Word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my path. The Word is a light. Messiah is the light. It's all
Absolutely.
right.
So I think you can see, if there is darkness upon the face of the deep and there is submerged chaos, you can, people have allegorized this in many different ways to talk about, that the days of creation kind of reference a spiritual principle of coming out of darkness and into light. And, that's entirely valid. I have heard a couple of people who have taken the 6 days of creation and have extracted spiritual principles of how this is like your walk of life and how you come out of darkness and into this marvelous light, and then you begin to learn and you begin to grow. And I think that's entirely applicable. And frankly, how many of you guys, you probably all seen Holyssa Alewine do her Creation Gospel series. My goodness, that is tremendous insights into these 6 days of creation and how it lines up with a ton of stuff. The feast days, the 7 churches of Revelation, the progression of faith, just so many different areas. The 7 spirits of God, the 7 wicked spirits. It's just so much. Like I said at the beginning, there's no way we can scratch the surface just barely with this stuff, but it's so powerful. So, and here's one other thing, and this is another calendar issue, is that you can read these places as though it was becoming evening and it was becoming morning. Well, there you go. It doesn't say necessarily it was evening and morning, and so that you can't say the day begins from the evening until evening, as the Hebrews currently recognize a day beginning.
Dusk to dusk, right?
Dusk to dusk, yeah.
Sundown to sundown.
It could be, yeah. So they say sundown to sundown, and you could certainly read this just like you could read the earth became an empty wasteland. You can also say that it is coming to be. It's the same word. It is coming to be evening. It was coming to be morning, day one. So that's another interesting insight, is that there's a potential that the day could start at dawn. Now, what are the practical applications of that? That is another calendar issue, but that is a good practical thing. Okay, if the day, yeah, that's from a practical standpoint, that is pretty powerful. I mean, if the day frankly, if you're going to observe the Sabbath, whether it's on coordinated to a new moon day, or whether you're doing it on Saturday, or whether you're doing it on whatever day, I don't know. But if you don't know when the day begins, you got an issue there.
Right. But Erev, evening, also doesn't mean sundown, because you can also read that evening and morning make the day, meaning the day consists of evening and morning. Evening was always part of the day.
Yeah.
I mean, the morning hours were from sunrise to about noon, and the evening hours from noon to sundown. And between the evenings was someplace.
Yeah, that's the way the Jews consider it, is that sometime between after the sun is at meridian and when the sun goes down is between the evenings.
Right. But so for me, if the evening would start a day, but the evening still belongs to the day, evening doesn't mean sundown. Or we had morning and evening sacrifices that belong to that day.
Sure.
So I really don't see any scripture that would affirm that the day can possibly start in the evening.
There's only a couple that I have seen, and frankly, those are easily explainable. And I think, I'm not taking a firm position on this, but I think that it is entirely likely that the day begins at dawn. Yeah. I think there's enough biblical evidence to suggest that. And frankly, I see enough evidence for my own personal interpretation. And I know that Scripture is not a matter of one's personal interpretation, but I have looked at this, and there's enough evidence for me to say, you know what? I'm going to observe Shabbat until Sunday morning. There's enough evidence for me to say I'm going to observe Shabbat until Sunday morning. And I'll end with this. How about that? Because I know we've been going for a little while.
Turn the lights off.
We didn't get very far, but yeah, hey, it was fun times. I'm going to throw this out here, okay? We're all whacked out on the days and the months and the years. I don't see the answer to the question, not yet. God will reveal it when the time is right. Until that time, we need to get along. That's the main point for right now. We need to be able to fellowship with one another.
Be a body.
And if we say, I'm going to take this calendar position, which is really totally different than anybody else, who are you fellowshipping with? No one? I mean, I'm appreciating what you are saying, because you're saying, well, I'm a lunar Sabbatarian. You guys aren't, like, according to my opinion, you guys aren't, worshiping on Shabbat at all. And yet here you are. That's the important part, is that we are going to disagree. But you know what? I think that on the fundamental issues of should we be searching out the truth, should we be doing what the Bible says? Yes, absolutely. There are some gray areas which we're still hammering out. And, may the Lord guide us and protect us from error.
That's right.
And help us.
God's mercies and graces on you, because He knows.
We want to
Of a
know.
lot of stuff.
We want to know.
May we enter His rest.
May we enter His rest, indeed.
Peace.